There's paper and pens on the table, and I would love it if you guys doodle and scribble along the way while we're talking. Maybe, I was going to go into a long explanation of the pattern language and the theory of place, and maybe pass some of those markers down the table so people can grab. But I think that kind of gives you the feeling of this idea of analyzing a place. And you probably all have a place, or you have a pattern of living here where, maybe there's certain places that are already important to you. And, you don't have to tell the whole encyclopedic story of Provincetown and Cape Cod for everybody else, just for yourself. And meanwhile, we're going to, so Traven introduced this book, and it's just amazing. It divides this way of looking at place into townscape, building, your own personal experience. So it goes from global down to local. And let's see, I have a whole slideshow, which I won't show, thankfully, but I'll just refer to a few pieces of it. But as an introduction, and obviously this whole exercise, maybe not obviously, is about how do we adapt this place, how do public and private individuals, artists, designers, how do we survive? How do we adapt this place to the changes that are coming? Climate change is very much on our minds. Climate resiliency is very much on our minds. But also, we first need to know the place, and how is this place constructed? How do people live on the waterfront? What are the things that are important to us? And so I took my iPhone and I just walked from one end of town to the other. Let's see if I can get this to play. So this is just me walking 3 miles. It's a few minutes long, and I'm going to let it go as we talk. But, you start to see all these different approaches to creating. Yeah, it starts at the Beachcomber Club, not the entire town. But all the different ways, and right here for a minute, you're going to see the tide level. So here's mean sea level right here. And these are storm tides and sea level rise. Obviously, it's a little janky. I'm going to try and really redo this in a high-tech way so that it'll be super accurate. But you can see that these things sort of happen by accident. The way we live is like a series of, it's history and accidents, it's preferences, it's mistaken ideas, it's us sort of holding on to a way of life that we had in our minds but wasn't necessarily paying attention to the real world. And in some cases, it is very well adapted to the real world. You might know that in the history of Provincetown, Front Street, Commercial Street, was the afterthought to the back street, Bradford Street, and that a lot of these houses on the beach were originally front yards. They were originally empty. The beach itself was a highway. It was the place where the carts traveled to deliver goods, to pick up seaweed. That was one of the main transportation routes. And how did all this building happen? It was a change of culture. It was, Provincetown had a heyday. It had its, it had its economic heyday probably peaking in around 1800 or so, with the whaling industry, with the fishing industry. And then it was abandoned. Pretty much the national economy left Provincetown behind. And that resulted in us having this beautiful townscape footprint with the narrow streets and no setbacks and a kind of a accumulation of little Cape Cod boxes. Sorry for the dizzying. I'll edit that out. But there's the old Reliable Wharf. We're coming behind the post office now. And you can see that it'd be really cool to start to separate this out and make notes on each place and how vulnerable they are. Almost all of Provincetown is pre-existing non-conforming. It's all grandfathered. None of it meets the standards that are law today. But people don't even realize you would never get permission to build all these structures in an active coastal zone from scratch if there was nothing here. And so that's a cool exercise, is imagine what town we would build if there was nothing here, if we had a clean slate. So one of the things that you allude to is that for this, I think Provincetown and all of these New England towns, we're going to be here. We're not going away. People ask, oh, should I buy this house? Should I sell my house? Should I abandon it? No. There's so many values that are important to us that the town will stay, we will stay. And so there's going to be adaptation. And, the regulations are kind of tough to change. Regulations will provide us guidelines for how to build resilient structures in the coastal zone. But then we all, as a town and individually, will have some really tough decisions about adaptation and retreat. Commercial Street already has an analysis that shows the low-lying road sections that are subject to flood now, and some of those can be raised, but others, there's just not enough leeway to continue with all those houses on the beach. And so how does that happen? Part of the pattern language of this town is artists and creative people and new young entrepreneurs and a whole generation of workers that maybe went to high school and now want to start a life here. How do we ensure that? I don't have a lot of answers to that. Let's see. So just to throw down for a second, some of you have seen this map. But this is the flood zones on the beach. This is the FEMA zones, the FEMA zoning. Purple
is the 100-year flood?
Yeah, basically this is the velocity zone down here, this lighter blue. And then this is the 100-year flood. And then this stuff back here, which should be a different color, is actually, it's inland flooding. It's maybe the 500-year flood zone. Anyway, it's land subject to flooding. Most of this, it's really fascinating to see Route 6 running straight through a continuous swamp. Right. You don't see that from your car. But the FEMA zones are quite valuable and interesting. And one of the shocking things about them is that this is a snapshot of today. So FEMA, the flood insurance program, is based on the likelihood of flooding now, under certain circumstances. So it's not a plan for the future. It's a plan to accommodate the present. And so as sea level rises, or as we seem to be getting more and more storms, there's a couple things that we already see happening. One is there's nowhere for the water to go. So particularly these swamps and these places that are only marginally connected to the waterfront, once the water gets in there, it takes days and days for the water to either percolate out. The town is already, so a couple of great projects that have happened. There's this stormwater pathways study, which the Cape Cod Commission and the Center for Coastal Studies has put together, which shows where does it leak? Where does the stormwater come through? And we can manage the situation temporarily by building, you see that they go out with the bulldozers and they build a berm around the beach. It's tricky because you can only do that on land the town owns. You can't just go on some private property and build a berm, even if it's going to protect a whole neighborhood. There's a process for doing that. So stormwater pathways is a new revelation. It's a new little pattern to throw into our encyclopedia. But another thing is this, there's, anyone know Court Street?
Yes.
And you ever tried to drive through Court Street after a rain? And
Yeah.
tell us.
Car bottoms out in a puddle.
It's like 2 feet deep in places, right? And so what should we do about Court Street? I can tell you some options, but what do you think? Because in the neighborhood they say, this ain't right. Protect us from this water.
Try raising the level.
Well, yeah. So that's the question. Where does the water want to go? And if there wasn't a town, yeah. Did you want to say?
Where can it go?
Well,
With all the restrictions.
Yeah. So that's because we're dealing with we have this town already built, but if there was no town, where would the water want to go?
You're right.
So this idea of restoring natural habitats, it seems so impractical and so absurd to turn Provincetown into a series of natural habitats, but it's a way to change our thinking about structures and trying to strictly manage nature. So and also another piece of information is that the town already has a plan in place for a $5 to $7 million pumping station underground at Court Street. Now, and again, that's going to accommodate the existing situation, but it doesn't look to the future at all. And how long does a pumping station last? And what's the annual cost and the maintenance of that pumping station?
Where are they going to pump the water? Back in the ocean?
Exactly the right question. Where are they going to pump the water? So the town engineers, and they're great. They were looking like, where is this? So they've calculated how many gallons, like something like 50,000 gallons of water after a storm, and it can't go into the groundwater because the groundwater is already too high, and the groundwater would have to retreat sort of town-wide for that water to just percolate out. So they looked at, well, we could just send it over to Champaigner. Just pump it over into this beautiful Quaking Bog refuge area that everybody's spent so much effort to keep pristine, and and then they go, oh yeah, we'll have to treat it first, so we need a treatment plant for it. And then they looked at some other open space where they could pump it, and the solution, it's like in here, solution is they're going to pump it over here to Duck Pond. So this is like, we have to be able to brainstorm. We have to even throw down things that, I don't know, are outside the box. But dehydration or evaporation means we got to put the water somewhere while it evaporates. Do we build how?
How the big hollows out in the dunes.
There's all the,
No pools.
well, we have a fantastic matrix of sand that loves water, loves to suck up water. But our town just happens to be, about a half mile away from all that. It's so close but so far. So I don't know. All I would say is that you need to put 50,000 gallons of water somewhere for about 72 hours. And so this restoration idea. So the town is building its pumping station. They're going to put the water here. Who else wants a pumping station, by the way? How about Holland Street? How about further east? So we're going to have the whole town we could just give engineers a lot of work, engineering the town. But eventually, it's going to be Venice. It's going to be floating. So the restoration idea would be what if we turn this into a pond, we buy these people out, close the road, and you have a little nature area there, and let the water sit. How much would that cost? Who will object? Whose dream of the future is dashed if we do that? And what's the overall benefit? So part of this whole problem solving is, how do we balance everybody's desires and needs in a way that fits our culture, that is fair? And then you have to convince. Can you imagine the town meeting? Good question. Let's get our team to make that water table map. We actually have water table maps generally. We can do that. So that's You, so part of the theme here is like, what can artists do? What can art do? What can and so if we team together with some soil scientists, hydrologists, and artists to visualize this, let's do a 3D visualization of this, of where is the groundwater? What if you could put on your virtual glasses and walk through town and see how deep the water table is below every street? What if? Let's see. I think we should pivot a little bit to, well, so this is kind of like a cool little artistic pattern. Any idea what it represents?
Christmas tree.
It could be a forest in Michigan. It's probably not. But you guys know what that is, right? Tides. So has anyone ever seen the tides represented this way? As an artist, this is me kind of doodling with images of the tides. Well,
You got a spring tide in there, I think.
so let's just say, it's okay. Here's some moons. Here's so let's say this is a big tide, so this is a full or a new moon. This is also known as a spring tide. Spring tide. And what's in between spring tides? I heard it. A neap tide. So this is a half moon. Do you guys know? So I love for people to have this little image in their head of the planet circling and affecting your well-being. Everyone wants to read their horoscopes, but what happens when there's a neap tide? Can anyone do the planets with your hands? Everybody. So okay, let's make us. We need 3 hands to do this right.
There you go.
So here's the sun. Here's the earth. Here's the moon. So when the moon is here, how much gravity is there? And where's it go? Where's it pulling?
Towards the sun and the moon.
Yeah. So we got a spring tide. We have a big tide, a big bulge of water on the earth here, towards both of these bodies have gravity pulling the tide that way. But guess what? Same thing's happening over here, on the back of the earth. That's because of centripetal force, because of the rotation of the earth. Then what if the moon's here?
That would be your neap side.
There's a kind of an angle of attraction that's the combination of this mass and this mass pulling the tide. It's going to be a lot less. It's going to be a lot more spread out, and so that'll be the lower tide, the half moon tide. Also notice that the full moon or the new moon, full moon here, new moon here, half moon here. It's you can read the relationship of the planets from this and relate it to your life. So, thank you, son.
Yes.
So these are daily tides, 2 tides a day. 2 high tides, 2 low tides every day, 6.5 hours, and it's like a clock. It's like a clock. If you go to the NOAA website and look at the tides, it will predict tides 1,000 years from now. But that's not always what happens. So what else happens with the tides is there's weather and temperature and salinity even that's pushing the water. So it's adding to the tide. So this little brown thing is actual tides. This is the astronomical tide. This is high tides. I connected all the high tides, all the low tides, astronomical tide, and there's the tide being pushed by the weather. And so, if you have that house that's not quite at the right elevation on the shoreline, what's your least favorite moment in the weather calendar? Yes, and so that's the spring tide, full moon, and
Storm surge.
okay, we got wind, we have a storm. We have the swell could be a result of some of these things. We have a full moon. So the time we have to worry about here, the time when this is when we have all of these forces pushing water onto the land all at once. Know nothing about Boundbrook Island in Wellfleet. I mean, there's a series of these coastal islands in Wellfleet.
It was an island. Apparently, a friend of mine told me before it's working.
It was an island in the, before about 1803. Here's these Wellfleet Islands here. And they're connected by barrier beaches. And so there used to be a harbor at Duck Harbor, and recently it broke through again. My theory is that we've had such an increase in the frequency of storms that the beach hasn't had time to rebuild. These beaches are built by sand being deposited along the shoreline. And so it just keeps getting hit. More and more waters come in. And my favorite image of the coastal catastrophe is 90-year-old Penelope Jenks being rescued from her sculpture studio on Boundbrook Island by a Coast Guard dinghy on a public road about a mile away from the ocean. So Lieutenant Island is around here, right?
Yeah, that's it.
And this is a really interesting model for a solution. It's a low tide road. If you live out there, you can only drive to your house when the tide is low. And, it's kind of an agreement that we're not going to raise the road. We're not going to call in the engineers. You're just going to have to get a watch and a tide table. Think if parts of Commercial Street were deemed low tide roads.
Boat, right?
I mean,
people on islands have always used.
It is an island. Yeah. With these tides, just to make a better understanding of things is, I had this proposal to do a mural on the seawall in the center of town. This is just a little cartoon, but what if we put those tides, painted those tides on the wall, and so you could, at a glance, look at the water levels and say, okay, it's mean sea level. It's and we know it's good. Water's going to go up 3 more feet. It's like another kind of a clock. And here's the feet. So that if you know Macmillan Wharf and the seawall in the center of town, that wall is about 17 feet. So mean sea level is about 5 feet. So this is all about using your experience and using your body and whether you're an artist or not, to kind of like to constantly be mapping the places, And so if you go out to the Provincetown Harbor and you walk at low tide on the wet line on the beach, and if you take a pencil or something and just look straight ahead, you're looking at sea level, mean sea level, because most of us, our eye level is about 5 feet, maybe a few inches. I'm 5'8". I'm not exactly a short guy, but I guess I am. But yeah, so you can kind of map with your eye where mean sea level is if you walk at low tide. And then imagine, we talked about this in one of the other sessions, the tide range. Okay, we know, right? We did this before. It's 7th grade, it's science because you guys know the tide range, right? Because we studied that. Who knows the tide range in Provincetown? Yeah, good. So sea level is 5. Pretty much that spring tide, high tide is 10 and a half. Storm tides go up to over 11. It's really fun to look at the NOAA tide chart. NOAA Tides and Currents website, type in NOAA Tides and Currents Provincetown, and you can get a whole calendar of all the highs and lows. So we have this 9-10 foot tide range, and what does Chatham have? No idea, right? It's only
5.
Look it up.
Oh, I know. It's about 3.5 feet.
3.5, really? Wow.
Chatham, which is 40 miles from here, it's about 3.5 feet. The reason for that, let's talk about.
Figure that.
Okay, let's talk about the Gulf of Maine. Here's an artist map. I created a print of this map on a floor about the size of this room in the Cape Cod Museum of Art a few years ago. And, there's a couple things that we can get from this map.
Just point out the Cape so people get
Okay, yeah, here's Cape Cod here. And everything in yellow is shallower water. But it's also designed to show, wait, let's first get to that question of Chatham's here, Provincetown's here. This is the Gulf of Maine, which is a little basin, ocean basin perched above the continental shelf. Here's the continental shelf. This is ocean weather, ocean conditions. These are big winds. These are global forces down here. This is the Grand Canyon. Obama created a new national monument down here, canyons and seamounts. If you were standing here, if we drained the oceans, how deep would you be looking? A couple miles.
10,000 feet.
So yeah, at least 10,000 feet. Boom, it's called the abyss. I love scientists. So just to get an idea of this little basin, which has its own conditions, which has created our tides, the tides that we have. Okay, Cape Cod Bay is on the order of 150 feet deep, 200 feet deep, 52 to 200. Massachusetts Bay, which is here, it's like 900 to 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet. So eighth of a mile deep. And then the seafloor, 10,000, 15,000 and more. So different conditions. So, okay, and then again, this is a little puzzle. I'm constructing a story as we go along here. When did the first people come here? Let's not say here, let's say Truro, because Provincetown didn't exist yet. Seriously. When did the first humans arrive on Cape Cod in New England? Well, we could give them a name. We could call them the Wampanoags. They call them the people of the first light. You know, do you know the story? Who knows the story of people arriving here? Really? So
I guess like 10,000 years, but I have no idea.
that's a good guess. That's a really good guess. And why did you use that number?
I don't know. I just feel like I've heard it before, maybe.
Okay, all right, good. No.
I have no idea.
So one thing as an artist and a storyteller and as an environmental person, I want people to constantly ask why. And constantly, you don't have to memorize like how deep is the ocean, but let's have a story that explains it, and then you'll never forget, right? You don't think so?
Oh, that's good.
So if people came here 12,000 years ago, why did they choose to come then? What was happening in the lives of those humans?
I remember it was
Sea levels were changing.
lots of food.
What else was changing 12,000 years ago? Glaciers. Okay, so think the planet, the glacial period. Like you read geology and you go, okay, the glaciation started like, I don't know, 1.5 million years ago, and then there was a glacial periods because of some wobble in the orbit. I don't know. You go, and it doesn't seem real. Does it seem real? No. Well, some of it's real. Some of it is real. Some of it is real to us. Like this is what I would want to do as an artist. Is like take you on a walk and say, this is about glaciers and it's very real to your life today. Let's talk about those first people that came here. Let's say you arrived on Mayflower or something. That's maybe 12 generations. And you could actually name those people. You could, how many people know anything about their great-grandparents? Anybody? Yeah, a little bit. So great-grandparents times, that's 3, so times 4 gets you back 12 generations. It's not a heavy lift, right, to have stories that go back there. And all of our written history, is in, let's say, a few thousand years, dozens of generations. But that 12,000 years is how many generations? It's about 400. Lives are shorter, you could say, 300 to 400 generations, 300 to 400 grandparents. So only about, say, 50 of those 400 generations, they're writing stuff down. So there's this entire history, entire firsthand observation of sea level rise, of glaciers coming and going, that we would kind of, it would be our desire to find it in the stories and fables of those people, whatever they left, whatever they passed along. And so there you go, artists. Start putting down some stories and fables, because when the internet goes away and everything is lost, you want to be able to tell that story of like, the story that I've looked at some of the traditional stories of the Wampanoag, the New England peoples, and there's a story of Moshup. Anybody heard of Moshup? So who was he?
I don't really remember if I know the name.
Okay. There's streets named after him. He wasn't a god, he was a giant. He was a human giant who was the helper for, in fact, a lot of the New England tribes have a giant figure, a hero in their mythology. And he was Martha's Vineyard's part of the first people, and he taught them, how to pull up trees and build fires and cook whales, and he was the helper for their culture. But one thing he did in the story is he was pissed off at his children. They're just like, ugh.
Problem.
Right? It happens. Some of us don't know about that. But so, first thing he did is he would throw out the ashes from his pipe and the sand from his moccasins, and he made the islands. Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket those islands were made by him tossing out the ashes. But then he's on the edge of the island, and sea level was lower, and he said, "Kids, you're on your own. Go over there. Just go over there." And he scrapes his moccasin in the sand, and the water rushes in, and they're on an island. It's like, ha, took care of it. So that's a very well-known story, but it's also a direct observation of climate change, sea level rise, and geology embedded in a traditional story, And I'm like really looking to find more of those that kind of, what was that human experience of watching sea level? So sea level rose. So back to the map. Everything yellow here at the time of Moshup was dry land. So Cape Cod is here, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. You could walk another 20, 30 miles past Nantucket before you get to the coast.
What's the section of yellow, like mountain right?
Yes, good question. What do you think? What would this be? Suddenly,
Northern Island.
George's Bank, George's Island. So back at that time, and I have a buddy. Okay, so I also put in the Pleistocene megafauna, the animals that were here when humans arrived that were slowly going extinct because of the loss of the forest, climate change, and hungry people. Whatever they did. It wasn't people alone, but so we have short-faced bear, mastodon, woolly mammoth, walruses, some of the, sharks and whales are still here. They're giant wolves. This, George's Bank, was an island full of forests and mastodons. Imagine like hairy elephants 100 miles offshore in a forest. That's real. That's real. You don't even have to make that up. That's real. I have a buddy. He's a fisherman. He goes off, and he called me one day, "Mark, you got to see this." He's like he sent me pictures and texts, and he goes, "They pulled up a walrus skull off George's Bank. 12-inch tusks. It's 5,000 years old." He's like, "What should I do with it, Mark?" Like, hang on to that, because there's dozens of walrus skulls that have been recovered by fishermen and mastodon teeth, molars about this big, and stumps of trees and all that. So, okay, so sea level rose, the glaciers retreated, there were pathways for human migration. Yeah, so and then, there's all these stories about, like, how did people live back then? And Samuel de Champlain, the first guys who drew maps of New England in 1604, I believe, 1602 maybe. He did a map of Nauset here, and he showed pictures of people in giant dugout canoes, 40 people in a dugout canoe. Where did they get that tree? It's a big, chestnut tree. And, I told this story the other day, but basically one of the kids in a class I was teaching, he goes, everyone knows that things were bigger back then. But he was a Wampanoag kid, and he's right. There were these giant forests back then, and there were big trees. And so let's see, where's this going? So let's go back to the tide thing, and then we'll come back to the present. So two things. As sea level has risen over this island, turned it into an underwater shoal. Fish love it. It still has sand dunes moving around underwater on it. Occasionally, this is only at times 100 feet deep, 60 feet deep. There's legends of, like, fishermen be like, oh, there's a new island. I'm going to jump out and walk around. Yeah.
How far is it? Like, if you leave Cape Cod
How far is
by boat and want to be above, like, George's Bay, how long does it take you?
It's about 100 miles as a crow flies, so a couple hours in a boat. I don't know how many. They go out there to rescue whales and stuff. When we put this on the floor of the museum and people were walking around, and Scott Landry, who does the disentanglement projects at Coastal Studies, he's like, yeah, a lot of humpbacks here. They come in here, they like to feed here. So anyway, back to the tides. This sometimes behaves like a separate water body, because it used to be, Nova Scotia is here just off the map. Water rushes in and out, very shallow compared to this. And the thing and Provincetown and Cape Cod is inside this basin. Chatham down here is facing the outside. It's more, there's actually, it's a whole ecological province. Georges Bank is different from the mid-Atlantic down here in terms of the species, fish species, circulation systems. They might as well be like a different ecological continent from here to here. And one thing that's happening is warm water species kind of get up here and get trapped, and then they're discovering more and more warm water species that stay or may not survive. But the tides, back to the tides, I kept going back to the tides. If you imagine this basin as somewhat separate, like, think of if you're walking upstairs with a big basin of water, and what happens? But it spills in a particular way. It gets a slosh.
Yeah.
There's that slosh going back and forth, and that slosh is actually, according to physics, it's a characteristic of this basin. The wavelength of the basin is a thing, and tides are a wave. Tides have a wavelength, and one of the principles of all this of wave energy is that they either add or they what do you call it? They interfere. Yeah, they're resonant tides or they're interfering tides. Exactly. So this happens to be in resonance with the moon tide, so it adds. So we have high tides because of that slosh. Yeah.
I remember it's complex, the little booklet, because it also bounces.
Yeah,
off the
there's.
wall and comes back.
Yeah.
And the Chatham tide is lower.
Yeah, because it's not sloshing down here. It's like there's a fetch here It was all the way to like the Carolinas, you know. I was over, here is the Elizabeth Islands, Cuttyhunk. We took field trips of kids over there. Buzzards Bay is here. Cuttyhunk, it's just off of Martha's Vineyard. And all these kids are like, look at the surf, look at the surf. And I'm like, that's odd. You know, we're in Nantucket Sound. Why would there be big surf in Nantucket Sound? And then I looked at the map and I'm like, there's a window here where you're not in the Sound. You're in right past Gay Head. You can look at 1,000 miles of ocean. So there's a surf break on the south shore of the Elizabeth Islands because of your position. I'm only saying this because like you can deduce a lot of this stuff by looking at maps. There's a lot of ways you can understand these systems without just learning it. You know, you can think about how systems work and incorporate that into your ideas of place. Let's see, we got about like 20 minutes left, right? Are we doing good?
Yeah, I have my drawings of ideas of place and maybe others.
Is everyone doing some drawings and stuff? This, I didn't even open the slideshow, and I don't feel the need to, except what have we left out of the discussion so far?
Sand moving?
Good. Sand movement. Okay, so that relates. I can, yeah.
Because it's gonna raise, water's gonna raise, but there's sand buildups that are gonna happen also, right?
You know, everyone's like, let's get more sand. Let's just like replenish the beaches. Let's just build a higher platform. You know, we'll just get more sand. Well, there's only so much sand. There's not unlimited sand. Where does the sand come from? What made our beaches? What are our beaches made of?
Crushed rocks.
Yeah. Who can give me the most clever answer based on some kind of like 10-year-old logic? Think like a 10-year-old.
Sand plant. Underwater sand plant.
What's that?
Sand from other places.
So good. I like that thinking. He says Africa. What did you say?
Sand from other places.
Sand from other places. Okay, let's say it's not even from sand. It's being made. What's sand made of? Well, crushed up shells. You're from Florida, right? No, I know. Quartz granite. Most of our sand is quartz granite. What's the nearest gigantic deposit of quartz granite? New Hampshire, the Appalachian Mountains. That's where our beaches came from. Can you figure out how that works?
See the glaciers.
Oh, yeah, the glaciers grinding and pushing down.
Yep. So the glaciers came, they just like, they picked up everything from this area, and then the glaciers parked here, and as the glaciers were melting, they dropped off all this sand and stuff and created, the Outer Cape is all outwash plains. So as the glaciers were parked there for 100 years, 1,000 years, the water's melting off the glaciers, it's making layers of whatever was in the mix. What's that great Miyazaki film, Spirited Away, and there's the big monster, big mud monster, and you start pulling bicycles out and stuff. That's the glacier. It's full of, the mountains are in there. It's peeling them out. It created these, the platform. This is a geology map. So these are the plains, the outwash plains to here, deposited by the glaciers, took a long time. It's moderately well sorted in layers. There's a story. If you cut through it, you see the story of the layers in time. That's our sand supply. You could stand on the edge in the middle of Wellfleet, and you're standing on the sand supply. And what happens is waves now from ocean, from big weather out in the ocean, can now come across Georges Bank. 10,000 years ago, they couldn't do it. Now they're coming. More and more waves are coming from the southeast, more energy, and predominantly from the southeast. And so that means they hit the Cape, and that force is moving northward. So these cliffs retreating 3 to 5 feet per year. If you have a house in mind along here, each one of your footprints is about a foot. Pace out 30 feet, you can have a 30-year mortgage. Because, oh no, that's not right. I said 3 feet per year. So you need 90 feet, you need 150 feet. Yeah. It's
Space to back it up.
yeah, and then you need another piece of land to put it on once it's but yeah, so that's where so we do have a lot of the raw material for sand. But then, what happens is that that sand gets eroded. It's carried in the near shore in submerged bars. Peaked Hill bars are the storage for all that sand that's eroded off the beach, and then they're being dropped off in Provincetown. And Provincetown is this beautiful yellow color here because it's completely different feature from the rest of Cape, and it was deposited between, say, 2,000 and 5,000 years ago. Where we're standing right now was open water, open ocean, a few thousand years ago, and it's different. It's the sand that's in the outwash plains was brought by the glaciers. Is all chopped up. It's like got sharp edges on it. If you pick up some of that sand from the Wellfleet Cliffs, you can kind of feel the edges on it. Scientists actually put it in a microscope and count the vertices, the angles in each piece of sand, and they can tell you kind of where it came from by how angular it is. Pick up sand from any beach in Provincetown, and it's rounded. Put it under a magnifying glass, it'll be rounded. Because it's been tumbled in the ocean and moved 20 to 30 miles, tumbling and getting polished, and then dropped off again and creating Provincetown. So then you say, okay, when do we run out of sand? Well, this is eroding. Well, the thing is, when it erodes, we need a new glacier to give us another cape. But also another super interesting thing, we're mentioning Wellfleet. Why is Duck Harbor not getting sand? Why is Duck Harbor now inundated by the storms and can't keep up? This whole spit, so everywhere you see a spit, that's like an arrow saying this is the direction that sand's moving offshore. If there's a spit, sand moved along that spit and the spit's growing in that direction. You can kind of read that. Same with Long Point here. The current is carrying sand to create that beautiful shape. It's all this beautiful geometry. The maps are beautiful. It's like nature has
Fluid dynamics.
Yeah. But interesting thing that happened here, this started to form before there was a Provincetown. And so there was waves coming from the north, pushing sand southward and building these spits and islands. And once Provincetown started to form, it blocked all those waves. So now there's a sand deficit down here. These are relic species that are not getting sand anymore. So they can get sand from Truro. They can get a little sand from a limited. And as you may know, there's a smudge here at the bottom, Billingsgate Island.
Right.
Billingsgate Island had a schoolhouse, a community, a lighthouse, I think a church, a bar. Did it have a bar? And so I'm not clear exactly when it disappeared. Early.
50 years ago?
50, did you say 50?
Yeah, I feel like it's on really low tides and you can still go see it.
My dad used to sail out to it.
Yeah, so there is still something there. Have you guys ever walked to Jeremy Point? Yeah, it's great. You can see the seawall that protected the lighthouse. You can see the foundation of the lighthouse from Jeremy. And maybe from the town, too. I don't know if you can see it. But low tide, there's a little remnant of that island. And the island was abandoned because it was, it was not getting sand anymore. It was eroding. Yeah.
So, I've talked to some people who like to think that theoretically their sand is being replenished. And so what I'm learning now is that Provincetown has blocked that replenishment. So that's really not happening. I mean, even without the consideration of sea level rise.
That's more or less true. And here's these systems, these coastal systems, these rivers of sand along the coast are defined by geologists as cells. And every cell, like this is one cell. Sand is moving. The sand moves all directions because there's different weather and waves. Some days the waves are coming from the north, some from the south. But predominantly, the sand is moving along this cell from a source, which actually the source is kind of spread out here, to the sink. And here's the sink. Provincetown is the sink where it's dropped off. So these cells, so the Center for Coastal Studies has done a lot of work on Cape Cod Bay where those sources and sinks are. And there's subsystems, like this, for example, from Race Point to Herring Cove is a subcell. And some of this huge sand supply moving up here makes it around the corner and feed. And Herring Cove is retreating, but Wood End and Long Point are growing. So down here, it's very kind of finely divided into places. There's not a huge sand supply, but there's some. And the other thing that happened is Pilgrim Lake or East Harbor used to be, so we've been talking all about a longshore movement of sand, but there's cross-shore movement of sand too. And when there was an inlet here, when it was a 500-foot wide inlet into East Harbor, then a lot of sand moved in and out, moved cross-shore, and it disturbed this flow. As soon as that was like blocked up for the railroad in the 1830s, before, then suddenly that sand had to go, was going sideways and not going in. So that's why you see those big wide beaches down there by sand, what's it called? Sea Glass Resort, all those little resorts there. But yeah, so I would like what these people have to do to figure out the rate of erosion is do like measurements in local measurements and observe sand movement locally to see where the beginning and end of their little mini cell is, see if they're getting some sand.